All right. Well, hopefully everyone is here. We'd like to welcome you to the first iteration of our Northeast Extension Fruit Consortium's 2026 Winter Webinar Series. My name is Evan Lentz from the University of Connecticut, fruit specialist. I'll be your host today. Today's session is entitled Management of Up and Coming Strawberry Diseases in the Northeastern United States. We have Dr. Nathaniel Westrick from the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station here with us today. And Nate is a plant pathologist with the station. His research focuses on the biology and management of fungal plant pathogens on a range of specialty and field crops.
Thanks, Evan. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate it. I will jump right in. And like he said, my name is Nate Westrick, and so I'm with a plant pathologist with the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station. Um, he gave a kind of general overview over who I am and what my research is. I'm mostly a mycologist. I study fungal diseases because that's the vast majority of plant diseases in basically every cropping system. But as just a kind of brief pitch to anyone in the room that might be from Connecticut, so we have uh, research station up in Windsor, Connecticut, where I'm mostly based, and then another one down in New Haven. And so if you are a Connecticut-based farmer, there are a bunch of perks that you get, such as free plant diagnostics and free nematode testing. So if you're curious about any of that based off of the talk that I'm giving, feel free to reach out. And just as kind of a primer and opening to this talk, I actually want to start with some of the things that we're not talking about quite as much. Because if you are either a farmer who's starting to get into strawberries or a very established farmer, there are certain diseases that are just going to basically be ever present. They're going to be kind of just something that you're managing under all circumstances. Um, the big fruit disease that you have on strawberries is actually it's gray mold. It's caused by Botrytis cinerea. It's this basically ubiquitous fungal organism that is in the air pretty much all the time. Uh, this is something that is actually the major reason why the spray programs for strawberries tends to be really tuned in and focused on the fruiting period to make sure that gray mold doesn't rot your fruit because that is obviously your product. But then you also have very common foliar diseases like common leaf spot and leaf scorch that pretty much are everywhere. And then powdery mildew that can either affect the foliar tissue, the leaves, or the fruit itself. And I'm these are probably the most common diseases that we have in the Northeast in general. They're just kind of all over the place. And the reason why I'm not focused on them as much is because for one, uh, we have a lot of products on the market that actually manage these quite well. There are just numerous spray program recommendations. We have things like Captan, Thyram, Luna Experience. We have copper. We have phosphites. You have rotation partners that you can basically get. And as long as you are on top of a spray program, you really shouldn't see meaningful yield loss from these. The foliar diseases, especially, they can kind of look scary. They'll give people the impression that they have bad disease problems. But until you hit about 25% of your leaf being covered by foliar disease, you really don't see any meaningful yield loss. So, kind of learning to accept that you're going to have a little bit of a few spots on your berries is probably helpful and it causes people to not go crazy. And like these examples are nowhere near 25%, even though they look kind of bad. So, I would say in general, these are things that are very manageable. But this talk, I wanted to get a focus specifically on some of these diseases that are either newer to our region or maybe old and coming back and are just generally harder to manage. These are not things that it's just a matter of putting down a couple of sprays and then you won't have any more. They are kind of like sometimes existential threats, but definitely just very difficult ones. And I'm going to focus on three diseases today. One is Anthracnose Crown Rot. This is a brand new disease to New England. We got our first report of it basically in 2024. Black root rot, which is actually a very old disease that has been making a comeback. And then finally, Neopestalotiopsis. And if you're a strawberry grower that has sort of been focused on the trades for the last couple of years, this has been most of the conversation. People are really, really concerned about this. And I actually wanted to talk about it mostly to kind of let people know that it's not as bad as you might think, especially in our region. But I still think it's important for us to consider how this disease affects us up in the Northeast. One of the big questions that I do get is why we suddenly have all of these invasive pathogens. And I can say that for one thing, it's partially that we're paying attention. We have a new crop of plant pathologists in the Northeast that are suddenly starting to look for things that might have been around. A lot of folks tend to think about it in terms of climate change. And until this winter, there's been a reasonable explanation that it's just, oh, well, we've had warmer winters. So some of these really, really cold temperatures that used to kind of kill off pathogens in the Northeast aren't there anymore. And now they're kind of pushing forward. And I think that there's probably a little bit of that, but my guess is actually that the much bigger problem and the reason why we're dealing with more diseases, not just on strawberries, but on a number of other crops, is just that there's more plant movement right now than we've ever seen before. We just live in a much more globalized society. We call this sometimes the Amazon effect, as in like Amazon shipping. And so we know that the likely route of the introduction for like Calototricum causing Anthracnose crown rot is almost certainly from the southeast north, and then Neopistolochiopsis has a bunch of different potential routes of entry. But back in the like 70s, 80s, 90s, we might have had a number of just local nurseries that were producing the plants that all the farmers would end up buying. And as long as they could keep something clean, then you were basically okay. And now I might have a single farmer that's buying plants from Indiana and Canada and California and Massachusetts. And even if you think you're buying from one nursery, it's possible they've actually sourced their plants from another place, which means that if you basically have any pathogen capable of killing plants in New England or the Northeast, it will probably eventually get here. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen so many new issues crop up. So the first one we're talking about is Anthracnose crown rot, and I can say just based off of looking around, this is not the most common disease, but it's just if it gets onto your farm, it can be kind of an existential one. We definitely didn't see this at all until very recently. It was sort of first peripherally identified in 2022. We published on it in 24, but it's very, very bad. You can basically go from a very healthy looking field like this in June to just a patch of dirt by August. And this is not in any way the worst picture we could find. Some of them were genuinely just literally patches of dirt, and I was told that it's not identifiable as a field, which is the reason why we found some ones that had a few straggling plants. But you can end up with genuinely about 100% mortality. And this disease, it's been common in the Southeast for a number of years, but down in the Southeast, in like Florida, they basically are growing strawberries often as an annual. And so they can basically just tear them everything out and then fumigate and replant. And so even if they deal with some of these disease issues, it hasn't been a huge issue for them. And it can be caused by a few different pathogens or species of this fungal genus called Calototricum. And what it does is it actually colonizes the crown of the strawberry and basically shuts down all of the vasculature, causing this really severe wilting phenotype that will just completely kill the plant in very short order. Now, this is a zoomed out version of what we consider to be just the steps of effective IPM, and I'm just going to use this as kind of a guide to walk through how we start thinking about Calototricum or Anthracnose crown rot. And we have a similar approach to a lot of the other diseases that we're going to talk about later, but just to focus on it now, the first step is always to identify it. We need to know what actual pathogen we're dealing with. And that was just the first thing that I did when I got to Connecticut a few years ago is we identified the actual causative agent as Calototricum siemensii, which is the dominant source of Anthracnose crown rot down in the southern United States. We see that these are the Connecticut isolates. This is a phylogenetic tree. Basically, we use genetic testing to figure out what it was. But that's good. It means that we don't have some wild new disease popping up out of nowhere. This isn't a new species from abroad. It is almost certainly an isolate of the pathogen that has just sort of slowly made its way up north. And we can actually see if we look into the last few years of new cases of Anthracnose crown rot, that very consistently we see that almost all of the new Anthracnose crown rot in strawberries are siemensii. So even though a few different species can cause it, it seems like this is the one that's kind of taking over worldwide. And we have a sense that it's kind of been moving north for a while because in 2019, it was first confirmed in North Carolina. It was known to be in Florida before that. In 2021, it actually destroyed probably 40% of the entire strawberry breeding program in Maryland. And then it finally reached New England. And so in 2022, 2024. So yeah, it has been kind of making its way around. But now that we know what it is, we now have to start thinking about prevention. And this is sort of the way that you might want to try to keep it out of your field. And if they're established strawberry growers in the room, they certainly know about pre-plant fungicide dips. But even some people who have been growing strawberries forever, they often don't like doing the pre-plant dips just because it feels like they're kind of handling fungicides more closely than they would like to. And I have to say that I'm just a huge fan of these pre-plant dips. It's basically when you get a bare root strawberry, a dormant strawberry, you can just mix fungicides into a bucket and then physically dip all of these bare root strawberries into it. And it has a few benefits. One is that it's just very cheap compared to spraying pesticides across an entire field. You're using a very small amount of the actual product. It's also less environmentally harmful. Once again, you're not spraying it on everything. It's an incredibly targeted application of your fungicides, and you get into every single nook and cranny of the actual plant. And so we decided to see whether or not we could use these pre-plant fungicide dips to actually try to control ACR. And we basically inoculated dormant strawberries with the pathogen, incubated them for 48 hours to make sure that they could actually, the pathogen would infect. And then we treated with a few different commercially available fungicides and grew them out for about a month. And we saw very stark differences. You can see on the left here, we have these are different fungicides that we tried. Not all of them are actually labeled for as pre-plant dip, but we still figured we would at least try. This is the actual mode of action right here. Either you can see the number is basically indicative of how it's actually treating the fungus. And then these are pictures of the different treatments. And you can see some of them, like Reliant and Abound, uh, almost everything just died. Whereas we had a couple of these where the plants actually seemed to be relatively vigorous and healthy after about a month. And at the right, on the right over here, we actually see that there are, you can see the fresh weight of each of these plants. And even under the best possible treatment, it seems like it might not seem incredibly impressive compared to the non-inoculated control. And there's a couple of things. One, we were really punching these plants in the face. So we were giving them huge amounts of inoculum. So that's probably part of the problem. But also, you often do see a little bit of stunting with these pre-plant dips, but the plants grow out of it pretty quickly. And it's so beneficial if you want to establish like a 2 to 3 to 4 year perennial strawberry bed that we still recommend it. Um, these three products, Reliant, Abound, and Switch, are the only ones that are actually labeled as a pre-plant dip. And you can see that Switch by far is the most effective. And surprisingly, Abound, which had been the kind of grower standard recommended pre-plant dip for a number of years, appears to be pretty much entirely ineffective. It doesn't really seem to work at all. And we did some just plate testing using Abound, which has the active ingredient is oxystrobin, to see whether or not the fungus was resistant to it. And basically, you can see we're increasing the concentration of the fungicide in the bottom right of each of these little plates, going up and up and up until you get to the top left where you have a really, really high concentration. If you look at the very bottom, you see this is a different fungus that's susceptible. And as you increase in concentration to about 1 microgram per mil, it's completely killed by Abound. Whereas Caltotricum siamense appears to be completely resistant, pretty much. I shouldn't say completely resistant, but even at very, very high concentrations, it's still capable of growing. So it seems like it's pretty much completely resistant to this product. I broadly tell people that they probably need to move away from using QOIs, also known as Abound or Quadris in strawberries, because so many of the pathogens are now resistant to that chemistry. But still, this leaves us with a really nice option in the form of Switch. And Switch, while Reliant by itself, this is actually a product that upregulates plant defenses. It doesn't seem to do very much on its own. When you mix Switch, an active fungicide, with Reliant, which upregulates plant defenses, you can get this really, really nice synergistic interaction. So I'm a huge fan of basically mixing the plant defense regulators with an active fungicide. It's kind of this 1-2 punch that can really help with plant establishment. Okay, so that is the main tool we have for sort of trying to prevent it from cutting under your field, because when you're buying strawberries, you really have no way of knowing in any given nursery situation whether or not the plants that you're buying might be infected. So you can do that to try to keep it out. But what happens when you actually already have the disease on your farm? And that's when you get into the control step. And I should say that by far the best control mechanism in plant pathology in general is genetic resistant. So, if you can plant resistant varieties, then it just saves you all of the effort of spraying. It saves you all the effort of sort of pulling out plants early. It is the gold standard. And several studies have been done on what varieties in the Southeast are particularly resistant to Anthracnose Crown Rot, but none of those varieties really work in our climate. And so we didn't really have any information coming into this. But we did have some hints. that there was differences in varietal susceptibility. And you can see this is actually a farm that had Anthracnose Crown Rot on it. And these are four different rows of strawberries, all of different varieties. And we saw that Darselect on the left and Record on the right were pretty much completely untouched by it, whereas Malwina and AC Valley Sunset had pretty heavy mortality. So it tells us that there might be some amount of genetic resistance that we could actually look into. And to evaluate this, we ended up actually planting these relatively large randomized varietal trials, both in Windsor, Connecticut and Hampton, Connecticut. We had 18 varieties in the first year and 20 in the second year, and we basically inoculated all of them pretty heavily with the disease to see how many of them could actually make it through. And very conveniently, so these are the results from our first year of this trial. The top shows the disease incidence, so basically all of the frequency with which we actually saw wilting, and then the bottom shows mortality. And mortality is really what we care about. We found with ACR that if the plant can make it through the season, you actually tend to get a decent crop out of it. So you really just care if the plant dies. And we see a nice spread where some varieties you have almost 100% mortality. That's like AC Valley Sunset, Jewel, and Dickens. But then some down at this other end, you see relatively low mortality. These are all sort of just like tolerable losses. You really wouldn't have a huge hit to your bottom line if you planted these. And there are a couple interesting patterns here. One is just that the day neutral plants, these are things like Albion, EV2, Seascape, were broadly pretty tolerant to the disease. Whereas within the June bearers, which is most of what we grow up in the Northeast, there really wasn't any pattern. So the coloring on here is basically colored based off of whether these are early, mid, late bearing June bearers. And often in disease resistance, when you have some kind of physiological feature like a fruiting period, we see a relationship between fruiting period and disease resistance. And here we don't at all, which is actually very good news because it means that like if every single late bearing variety was very susceptible, then it would make it very hard for you to plant varieties that would get you through the full year. But in here, it seems like it's just kind of this jumble. We do have this open question about why are the day neutrals more resistant, and some people have pitched that there's something physiological about it. And what I actually think is happening is more that there's just a difference in geography for where a lot of these things were bred. And this is going to come up again when I talk about Neopestalochiopsis. But you have different breeding programs that are basically spread all around the country. And if a certain disease exists where that breeding program is, then they tend to just automatically select for tolerance at the very least, because if the disease kills one of their breeding lines, it's not moving forward by definition. And so these day neutrals tend to come out of either like Florida or California, where this disease has been present for a really, really long time. Whereas it's brand new to our region. So like Valley Sunset comes from Canada, Jewel and Dickens come from New York. It's maybe not surprising that completely in the absence of this disease, that they don't have particularly good tolerance to it. Another kind of difficult feature of this pathogen, though, is that Colototricum, this fungus in general, is known to either be able to live as an endophyte, so just asymptomatically colonize the plant, or actually cause disease. And because we knew that there was some risk of endophytic colonization, we went in at the very end of this trial and then actually tried to see what the frequency was that we could isolate the pathogen from all of these different varieties. And you can see on the bottom here, this is isolation frequency from 0 to 100. This was all on healthy tissue that had sort of survived the season. And the height of the bar is the actual isolation frequency. And you see that on this completely incredibly resistant variety, Mara de Bois, and then this very, very susceptible variety, Dickens, you have pretty much exactly the same isolation frequency. So that tells you that the resistance that we're looking at is not true resistance in that it's kind of holding the pathogen out or it's completely rejecting it. There are some types of resistance where you'd actually see the pathogen is attempting to get in, it's being kind of resisted by the plant. It seems like in this case, resistant varieties are actually holding the pathogen as an endophyte, which it's interesting, but it's also kind of a problem because it means that if you have this pathogen on your farm and you can suddenly start planting a bunch of your more tolerant varieties, if you come back and want to plant Dickens or Jewel or AC Valley Sunset a few years later, there's a good chance that the pathogen will be there, just kind of waiting for a really susceptible host. So it does mean that you're not going to be able to completely eliminate it from your farm. There's also a couple of other implications. And one thing is how do you manage an invisible pathogen? You're not actually seeing symptoms. Um, you might see symptoms in your susceptible ones, but maybe not in your others, and you don't know how to kind of keep your plants alive. Because really, what matters is stopping that transition from an endophyte to a pathogen. And one thing is that after harvest, often the recommendation by most of our extension specialists across the Northeast is to do something called renovation. It is you going through and you're mowing away all of the leaves, and it's a way of kind of removing diseased tissue, things like common leaf spot and scorch. And one of the problems that we run into is that if you have this kind of latent pathogen waiting for a susceptible host that's going to kind of show weakness, mowing off almost all of the tissue and damaging it really aggressively is one of the signals that seems to trigger that transition. So you can see here, this is actually a small study that we did where we inoculated some fields and left some others uninoculated, and then we either mowed or didn't mow, and the mowing led to dramatically higher mortality. So if you think you have this on your farm, and you want to keep the plants alive so you can get like a second harvest the following year, maybe another year after that. The two things that we really recommend doing is you really shouldn't renovate. You don't mow these plants down. Leave it as is. You can manage your foliar diseases separately. And then the other thing is trying to optimize nutrition. We think that nutrient stressed plants also seem to transition from kind of latent pathogen endophyte to pathogen at a higher rate. So just kind of fertilize the crap out of them. And the major takeaways as we get to the end of this disease is just the pre-plant dips. They are cheap and effective first line of defense, but you really do want to pick your chemistry wisely. And so switch is very efficacious. It seems to work well. Even in the absence of this pathogen, it seems like it just helps to clean up a lot of these other kind of nibblers, nibbling pathogens in the soil. And combining that with some plant defense elicitor, we used Reliant, but Actigard is another possibility, can be really beneficial for actually helping your plants to establish. In fields that didn't have any ACR, we still saw better plant establishment when we used this combination. If ACR is a concern, you want to prioritize varietal selection. The tolerant varieties are good to do, but a lot of it comes down to just really avoiding the very susceptible ones. Things like Valley Sunset, Wendy, Dickens, All Star, and Jewel. These can have up to 100% mortality in the field, and there's just no way to economically deal with that. But we do have a couple of good options, which is still helpful. And just this list kind of runs the gamut from early to mid to late. And so you actually should be able to cover a season pretty well. And also, just as I just mentioned, if you suspect ACRs on your farm, I would carefully consider post-harvest renovation protocols. So all the things that we normally tell you to do that would maybe damage the plant, and then you'd let them kind of recover from that. Talk to your local extension specialist about whether or not you might want to forego them because you don't absolutely need to mow. I'm calling this the 800-pound gorilla in the room because black root rot is by far, by an order of magnitude, the single biggest issue in strawberry production in the Northeast. If you are a strawberry grower, there's a reasonable chance that you've either seen yours or some other people's uh, plants that look kind of like this picture in the top left here, where there's just kind of, they're weak, they kind of are stunted. The lower leaves later in the season seem to die, the berries are small. And then when you pull them out of the ground, you see this kind of like black, blunt feature. And black root rot, unfortunately, unlike a lot of other plant diseases where you just have this nice etiology where you can say, cool, this pathogen is causing this disease, we can just do whatever experiments we need. This is actually something we call a disease complex. And that doesn't mean the disease is complicated. It actually means that it is a complex of a bunch of different things that can and often do interact to kill the plant. And when a lot of the time, only one of them is not enough to do any meaningful damage. Strawberries can often just outgrow individual pathogens. But when you get multiple kind of mixed together, you can basically go from what would be a really healthy root system on the left here to this just kind of black, shortened root structure where all of the white feeder roots that normally should be in a healthy strawberry are gone. In a good chunk of the Northeast, this is caused at least partially by lesion nematodes. Nematodes are kind of these little microscopic worms that we find in the soil, and they're called lesion nematodes because they cause these lesions on the roots of a number of different plants. They have a really broad host range. And once again, alone, you actually wouldn't see a huge problem with these. You might not even notice a real yield loss. But one of the problems with these lesions is this can provide a point of entry for other fungal pathogens like Rhizoctonia, Fusarium, or oomycetes like Phytophthora pithium that can then subsequently just kind of destroy your plant. It often doesn't kill the plant, and so that's one of the distinctions from Anthracnose Crown Rot is that ACR will actually lead to full mortality at the end of the season, whereas blackroot rot, you'll often just have very sickly looking plants. And I just want to, this is the pathogen that I'll say is not new, and I want to give a bit of a historical perspective. Um, this was a major problem in Northeastern strawberry production in the 1990s and early 2000s, probably going back to the 80s as well. And because it was such a big problem, there were actually two major labs that worked on it. Dr. Jim Lamondia, who was my predecessor at the Ag Station, and then Dr. Marvin Pritz, who is still at Cornell. And both of them kind of independently were researching blackroot rot and did quite a bit of good work on this. And both because of their work and also changes to kind of cultural practices and people planting better varieties and rotating properly, this stopped being a major problem for the kind of mid to early 2000s. But then back in 2023, this really came roaring back. I think a lot of it came down to the fact that we just had really historic flooding. My basement flooded multiple times that year. We also had there's kind of something we call the whack-a-mole principle in plant pathology, where we have some big disease issue and people focus all of their efforts and IPM protocols on getting rid of that. And then once it disappears, everything drifts away from it and we lose all the valuable varieties and all the good rotation recommendations. And then it can just, by the time it comes back, we just have to rediscover old knowledge. And then also there's some nursery consolidation. So it used to be we'd have a larger number of small nurseries that were kind of doing their best to keep things clean in a regional level. And now there's once again a lot of horse trading going on. So I think that there's been some introduction of pathogens through that mechanism. So this is it's a very complex problem. And I mentioned before that resistant varieties are kind of the gold standard. And there's this question of what varieties appear to be most resistant to blackroot rot. And one issue is that that likely depends on the actual pathogens on a given farm. And that makes varietal selection very, very difficult. I would say, and I'm going to mention this again, but broadly, if you don't know what's on your farm, the best, but you think you have blackroot rot, the best thing you can do for varietal selection is just go for the most vigorous growing plants you can. I think a lot of the time people focus on yield, and I totally understand that. But there's some varieties like Flavorfest, Valley Sunset, Cordial, Keepsake that just they are bred on non-fumigated fields and they tend to just be very, very vigorous more so than anything else. And so even if the pathogen is there, if you can have a root system that can just outgrow it, that is one method of keeping your plants alive and productive. Back in the day, we actually did breed plants specifically for blackroot rot resistance. We had Rubicon and Winona. And unfortunately, because this hasn't been a problem in about 20 years or a major one, those are no longer on the market because, once again, a whack-a-mole issue. And this is just an example, though, of some of the work that was done back in the day by Jim Lamondia. He did go through and screen 21 different strawberry cultivars for blackroot rot. And you don't need to go through this whole thing. It's kind of a complicated table. The important thing is just that we have the cultivars on the left and we have the yield change on the right. And so if you have a big yield change in the negatives, that's bad. In the positives, it's good. And we had a few back in the day varieties that were quite kind of tolerant of blackroot rot or even maybe grew better under that pressure. And one of the problems is all of these are kind of highlighted in green. Of this list, only two, Annapolis and Early Glow, are still things you can really buy in any meaningful way. Of the most of the varieties on this list that are they're actually the most popular, the ones that kind of you can buy from Norse and Indiana Berry Company, things like Sparkle, Jewel, Honeoy, and All Star, these are all incredibly susceptible. So I think that the industry and the kind of focus, the shift of everybody switching over to planting very, very susceptible varieties has probably also led to the increase in blackroot rot. And I apologize, I'm just throwing another kind of big table at you. You don't need to read it very closely, but this is just kind of the example that I wanted to give of why the specific pathogen in your field might matter. And so Cornell, Marvin Pritz specifically, his group did a trial for blackroot rot in 1995, and then this is Jim Lamondia's in 2004, and they had some of the same varieties, and one of them, Jewel, this was one of Marvin's best performing varieties, and they basically recommended that people plant it. Whereas this was one of the most susceptible varieties in our trials in Connecticut. And it very likely comes down to the fact that in Cornell and the New York trials, they really didn't have very high nematode pressure, but they had a lot of Pythium. But then they didn't have very much rhizoctonia. So the major thing that was actually causing black root rot for them was Pythium, this oomycete. Whereas in Connecticut, we have a lot of nematodes and a lot of rhizoctonia. So you end up kind of selecting for different things. And that's one of the reasons why it's kind of hard. And so I would recommend people, once again, send things in for diagnostic testing if you actually want to know what is physically causing this problem in your field. The biggest recommendation, and I think this is one of the things that kind of helped people get this issue under control back in the day, was just proper rotation. Um, and by rotating off of strawberries for a couple years or for a few years, you can really lower populations. But this is once again a situation where the individual pathogen causing an issue might dictate what you want to rotate with. And so if you talk to a lot of the Marvin, and I think heard him give talks on black root rot in the past, where the major thing is just rotate onto grasses. Grasses like rye, like oats, like wheat and such, these are not closely related to strawberries. They don't tend to have the same pathogens. And so if you rotate with those, you'll see a drop in pathogen count, and then you can just go back to strawberries later and you're fine. And in Connecticut, we actually found that some rotation partners like rye, which is by far the most common on a lot of farms to rotate with strawberries, because you can kind of grow it over the winter, can actually lead to an increase in nematode counts. And so strawberries, you see this is what happens if you go strawberry to strawberry. And then if you go strawberry to rye, they actually saw almost a doubling of nematodes in certain years. And so lesion nematodes have a really broad host range, so you have to be kind of careful about it. And then also, oats are both kind of grasses. They're monocots, but they can have wild, depending on what kind of oat you grow, they can have just wild differences in the amount of disease that you're actually suppressing or increasing. So we found that basically Gary oats, if you plant them, are the worst possible thing you could rotate with. They lead to an explosion of nematodes and often an increase in rhizoctonia, whereas Saya oats are actually amongst the best things. So they drop nematode counts quite well. So these are broad host range nematodes. So you can't just focus entirely on how closely related the host crops are when you're thinking about rotation partners. They also did some work with canola. I've gotten questions from folks on using canola or mustard as a biofumigant, and it can work against both the fungus and the nematodes. I just don't tend to recommend it, mostly because it can be very nitpicky. The nematode counts often increase with canola, and then the reason why it works as a just brassicas and mustards in general, especially mustard, but the ability to biofumigate using mustard depends on how you actually incorporate it into the soil. The soil needs to be appropriately wet. The timing really matters. And if you miss that timing, then you've actually made your problem worse, which is why I generally find that I'm hesitant to recommend it. One difference, though, from the old days to today, though, is that we do actually have new chemical options that didn't used to be around. There used to be more kind of a lot of the fumigants that we used back in the day are now illegal. We still do have some things that you can use for full fumigation, but I actually wouldn't recommend it. It's a really good idea if you are doing an annual crop, but if you want to grow strawberries as a perennial, which almost everyone in our region does, you'll usually get this kind of big drop in disease the following year, and then it comes roaring back in years 2, 3, and 4. Because you're basically sterilizing the soil, and then if the pathogens are still around, they find just fertile ground with no competitors, and so it can create a big problem. So yeah, unless you're under very specific circumstances, I don't usually recommend fumigating, although you can with chlorpicrin. But there are a couple of newer non-fumigant options that can be useful. These have been used in a bunch of other parts of the country. They're used pretty heavily in California a lot of the time, but they're kind of newer on the scene to New England. And one of them is that if you think you have either nematodes or fungi, vellum prime can be really helpful. This is actually an old chemistry. It's a frat group 7 in SDHI. But basically, it's a typical fungicide that people have found actually seems to have pretty good nematicide activity. And you can actually fumigate it through the drip lines. So you can, if you have an established field where you have a problem with black root rot, you can actually treat with vellum prime as a way of trying to knock down pathogen populations. Like I said, it's labeled for strawberry, but limited data in the Northeast. And then also Nimitz, this is a relatively new thing in our region, is that it's a non-fumigant nematicide. So you can actually incorporate this into the soil prior to planting, and it can just like dramatically drop nematode populations. We've done these experiments in tobacco, and so we know that it can work in our region pretty well. And so that is another thing if you think nematodes are driving some portion of your problem. On the other hand, If you think that Pythium is your issue, once again, talk to your local kind of diagnostic lab. This is, I would argue, maybe an easier to solve problem because things like Arondis gold, Renomil, these are things that can be fumigated through drip lines. They can be incorporated into the soil. They tend to be highly systemic and very, very effective. And so that is actually an easier to tackle problem than some of the fungal and nematode ones. And just the general takeaways for blackroot rot, this is almost an inevitability if strawberries are grown continuously in the same field without rotation, or even if the rotation is too short or not with the proper rotation partners. We see this all over. I was interviewed about this last summer, and basically, I think pretty much every strawberry that was in the ground in 2023 currently has blackroot rot, just because everything got way too wet. But there are ways that you can kind of mitigate how bad it is. You do want to select strawberry varieties that are known to be vigorous rather than simply high yielding. So if you, this is, I'm always hesitant to give specific varietal recommendations, but I know that things like Flavorfest, Dickens, Cordial Keepsake, Early Glow, AC Valley Sunset could be good picks because these come from breeding programs that don't tend to fumigate their soil. So the plants are just under a little bit more pressure and they tend to have just very vigorous root systems. Um, if you're farming either strawberries or anything else, there are certain things that you just kind of know cause problems for root diseases. And so none of this is going to be new. But over irrigation, especially in a plasticulture system, you can actually get caught in, like, I'm not sure if there's a better name for it, but like an irrigation cycle where the root system is so wet that blackroot rot settles in and then it degrades all of the fine white root tissue. But if you have a completely saturated soil, you don't really need fine white feeder roots. And so you might not notice the symptoms immediately. But then if you pull off on your irrigation, you suddenly have this plant that does not have the ability to take up enough water. And so you'll have bad symptoms. And so then you'll be forced to continue irrigating really heavily and it just makes the disease worse and worse and worse and worse. And so I would try to avoid on the front end over irrigating your plants. Proper drainage, obviously very important. You don't want these low wet spots where it's sitting for long periods of time. And also just compact soil makes every root issue harder to manage. So try not to overtill or drive over wet soil with your tractor. There are different local diagnostic labs in UMass and Yukon. CAS has one. If you're in Connecticut, we have free diagnostics. Every state, I think, in New England and the Northeast has at least one plant diagnostic lab. So I'd really recommend reaching out to them about what specific things are giving you a problem here because it really helps with recommendations. And then just the final thing, rotation off strawberries for 2 to 3 years can be really helpful in reducing inoculum. And I'm a big fan of sorghum sudan grass and saya oats as opposed to just rye, because once again, rye can create other problems for you. And then getting into just our very last pathogen here, this is Neopestalotiopsis. This is the new player on the scene. And if you've been reading almost anything, there were a lot of news articles that came out this last summer about how like this is the worst year for strawberries on record. I should say that I was the source of some of them in Connecticut. But in Pennsylvania and Indiana, we had a bunch of these came out that specifically blamed this pathogen. And I think that's likely incorrect. We first saw this in New England in 2023. These are actually pictures from New England, but this was a specific field of a variety called Ruby June that seems to be very, very susceptible. It is mostly a southern problem, as I'll get into, but you can see it from Mexico up through Canada. And it's most known for causing these kind of specific foliar spots. It looks a little bit like phomopsis, but the reason why it's a big problem is that it can get into the petioles and then sort of cause a petiole blight where the entire thing crown can look like it's collapsing and eventually it moves into the crowns and kills the plant. These are pictures of little spores. I think they're kind of cute. But the reason why I don't tend to think of it as being quite as existential problem here is that this was actually a greenhouse variety trial that was done in Indiana a few years ago. And these are all these different varieties. I actually color coded them to make it easier to look at. And basically, the height of the bars are focused off of the disease severity, so how bad the NEOP was infecting these plants. And all of the ones that are coded red are basically June-bearing plants that are specifically kind of southern varieties. A lot of them have the name Florida in them, so it's pretty easy to figure out. Florida Brilliance, Florida Radiance, Florida Sensation. And what we see is that the most susceptible ones do seem to be these southern varieties. The ones that are in green are the June-bearing varieties that are more common in our region. So things like Flavorfest, AC Valley Sunset, Malwina, Galetta, and you really don't see any disease on these. These were completely untouched in this variety trial. The only one of our varieties that was meaningfully susceptible was Dar Select. And then the only we have in blue, we have basically some varieties that can be grown in either region, and that's basically just Ruby June and Chandler. And Ruby June is the one that we had that entirely collapsed field on. Michigan had a really bad case of this too, but it was once again Ruby June. Almost any time we have a northern state with a bad neopy problem, it is Ruby June. So I would just tell people probably don't grow Ruby June. Um, and then the day neutrals do seem to be generally susceptible as well. I think that this is probably basically the inverse of what I talked about with Anthracnose Crown Rot. This is sort of the position that I've come to from talking to a lot of other plant pathologists. I think that neopy has actually been in our region for a long time. And I think that our breeding programs have naturally selected for some tolerance to it. Whereas it has not been present down in Florida, which is the reason why they had so much susceptibility. But we don't just want to trust this one study. I actually went in and we did a big field study using many more northern varieties. And we inoculated these outside to neopy as opposed to doing a greenhouse trial. And we got basically the same result, where these day neutrals were very, very susceptible to it. And then Dar Select was this kind of one exception that was also susceptible. And then the rest of our June bearing varieties, pretty much every single other one that we tried, we just could not find a fleck of disease on them when we inoculated, which I should say is good. But that brings up the question of, okay, so is there just nothing to worry about? Can we just kind of ignore this disease? And that's when I'm going to get into a bit of speculation because I don't think we can completely ignore it. Because the disease has been and is a major problem for nurseries. We had just the collapse of nursery plug production up in Canada because of this disease. Big North Carolina nursery went out of business because of it. And just like Colletotricum, Neopestalotiopsis can be an endophyte, so you can basically go through and have it colonizing a plant with no symptoms. And so we do in fields that seem to have black root rot, which I was presenting on before, a lot of the time I actually do find kind of some crown lesions and then I pull neopy out of it. We don't think that neopy is actually killing the plants and causing the black root rot. But there's this thought that if it's getting into the plugs and the tissue culture and the tip production really early and colonizing these plants fully, it seems to be kind of stunting them and weakening them in a way that makes them more susceptible to other disease. So we've been getting a lot of reports of stunted plugs throughout the mid-Atlantic, specifically on Galetta, which is by our testing completely resistant. So basically, we think that a lot of these northern varieties really aren't going to get it in the field. If you can plant and establish a good, healthy plant, then you're probably safe. But if your plants come in already with neopy, which is very, very hard for nurseries to screen out, then it can become a bit of a problem for you later on. It increases the susceptibility to everything else. But I would say if you go online, just Google it, you'll find pictures of classic neopy symptoms, and do not expect those on our varieties because that's really not what we see. So, given how kind of strange this is, what are the management implications? And so, a lot of it kind of gets back to the same things we were talking about with black root rot. Stunted plants do seem to more readily succumb to black root rot. So, just focus on clean fields, just focus on proper rotation, proper nutrition, and basically just trying to lower the inoculum density of everything else. And if you do that, then you can probably get a plant that is not going to succumb to this, and you might not even really see any yield losses. Also, once again, resistant, this Neopestalotiopsis, we've tested it, other people have tested it all throughout the country. It seems to be pretty much completely resistant to Abound, which is the same active ingredient as Quadris. And so I would just not bother using those QOI fungicides. But Switch does seem to be very, very effective as a pre-plant dip. And then if you, for whatever reason, are growing either Albion or Ruby June or Dar Select, and you do start to see symptoms and you're worried about it actually spreading throughout your field, Switch and Thyram both seem to be effective. You just have to basically, the disease really hits late in the season after fruiting, so you actually have to kind of go back in and spray when you normally wouldn't. But yeah, Switch and Thyram both seem to work well. And we're getting a little closer to the end of the time, so I'll just give some final thoughts. There's really, this is the problem is we have a bunch of different disease problems. So there's no silver bullet, but a lot of these common IPM practices can be just helpful. Things like field sanitation rotation, and pre-plant dips, they just can help quite a bit with establishment. And even though we don't have any one variety that is particularly susceptible or resistant to everything, um, if you can get an established strawberry, older, more established strawberries just generally do tend to be resistant to all diseases. We've had fields of like AC Valley Sunset that should be incredibly susceptible to Anthracnose Crown Rot, but they were like 7 years old and they're just untouched because the plant is just so vigorous and so healthy, the disease can't do anything. So that plant establishment is really your window to getting something that can last for years potentially. And then once again, some varieties are amazing choices in response to specific pathogens and diseases, but you do, some like Select as an example, where it's ACR tolerant and NeoP susceptible. There's not just going to be the one choice that you can plant it and it's going to solve all your problems. You do need to know what you have in your field. And so that is going to be my 17th pitch to talking to your local plant diagnostic lab. And with that, I think we have a few minutes left. And so if you have any questions, this is my dog, Jasper. He's the assistant to the farm manager. And this is my contact info. So if any of you have any questions about strawberry disease management, you can feel free to reach out.